evening, and thank you for this opportunity to talk with you tonight. We're here to talk about the actual state of our nation and how we can reclaim the promise of our democracy and the peaceful, just, green future we deserve. We've heard President Obama deliver his State of the Union address, and we heard the Republican response. Each claims to have the answer and that the other was the obstacle to progress. But the truth is that both sides, despite the rhetoric, are responsible for the harsh policies driving our economy and our democracy into deep crisis. Simply put, they both place the interests of Wall Street ahead of the needs of everyday people and the long-term welfare of our nation. So tonight, we're going to talk about the major problems not being solved by the political establishment, and we're going to focus on the key game-changing solutions that have been kept off the table for too long and whose time has come. As we speak tonight, our economy is not working for the vast majority of Americans, as you know. 146 million people, that's nearly 1 in every 2 Americans, is now living below or near the poverty level. The stress falls hardest on our most vulnerable and disadvantaged, with the majority of children, half of our elders, 3/4 of Latinos, 2/3 of African Americans living in or near poverty. Last year, 1 million Americans lost their health insurance, raising the numbers of the uninsured to almost 50 million of our people. Over 6 million Americans have lost their homes to foreclosure. 30 million college students and recent graduates are trapped in the financial prison of student loan debt. Most students must take out costly loans to meet the skyrocketing cost of tuition, yet paying off these loans is almost impossible as young people face double-digit unemployment and much lower pay, up to 40% less than their parents' generation received for the same work. Overall, nearly 25 million Americans are unemployed or unable to find full-time work. And even those who have jobs are struggling because wages have been declining for American workers and are now lower on average than they were in 1996. And household income has fallen faster since the official end of the recession than during the recession itself, because the so-called recovery is made up of mostly low-paying jobs. Over 7 million are under correctional supervision, 10 times greater than in 1965, as incarcerating poor people, disproportionately of color, has become big business with the failed war on drugs. And more African American males are now locked up in U.S. prisons than were slaves in 1850. America's creed is with liberty and justice for all. That is a creed of equality. But right now we're experiencing the worst economic inequality in our nation's history. The gap between the very rich and the many poor has never been so great. The wealthiest 1% in America now owns as much wealth as 90% of all Americans together, and those over 65 on average have 47 times as much wealth as the heads of households who are under 35. White families own on average 20 times as much as black families. Such inequality is unacceptable, unconscionable, and un-American. While the economy does not work for vast majority, it does work for a few, at least for now. The owners of big corporations are enjoying historic profits, with a record $2 trillion in cash reserves at home and nearly as much overseas. Though the corporate elite are richer than ever, they're contributing less than ever to the tax base that keeps the infrastructure going for their profits as well. Our schools, transportation, clean air and water, safe food, the legal system, the police and the military. In fact, 30 major corporations paid no corporate income tax at all over the past 3 years, despite making $160 billion in profits. And the big banks, whose fraud and greed crashed the economy to start with, are bigger than ever. Now, with the 6 biggest banks controlling capital equivalent to 60% of all economic activity in this country. To be clear, the greed for record profits is what got us into this mess in the first place. But of course, it wasn't greed alone. It was the capture of both political parties by Wall Street and other powerful corporations that buy influence with campaign contributions and lobbyists. Using this routine currency of American policymaking, Democrats and Republicans alike dismantled protections against waste, fraud, and abuse by Wall Street. This bipartisan cooperation enabled greed to crash the economy. And that not only killed jobs, it also depressed tax revenues, which has been one of the biggest drivers of the federal deficit. And that deficit has also been made worse by unconscionable spending choices, notably the $4 trillion spent on illegal wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and trillions more being spent on the bloated Pentagon budget, tax giveaways for the wealthy, and bailouts for Wall Street. And now, the political establishment in the White House, Congress, and state governments are making matters far worse, doing the opposite of what we need by inflicting needless, harsh austerity policies on the country. This is not good for people, it's not good for the economy, and it's completely unnecessary. Because when they say there's not enough money, what they really mean is that there's not enough money for you. Because instead of austerity, we can just simply stop the Wall Street bailouts. We can cut the bloated military, and we can tax the bloated rich. These austerity cuts mean that Americans are losing jobs, from Scott Walker to Andrew Cuomo, and yes, Barack Obama. The result of these austerity cuts is layoffs for teachers and nurses and child care and elder care workers and firefighters and janitors and bus drivers and all the people who keep our communities educated, healthy, and moving forward. And worse, these austerity cuts are hurting the people who receive those services: students, the disabled, elderly, the ill, unemployed, the hungry. These are the Americans who are suffering because of austerity cuts to education and financial aid, health care, fuel assistance, homeless shelters, prevention, food support, and more. And all of this adds up to the ongoing crisis that we face, the cumulative result of many years, decades of policies under both Democratic and Republican presidents that enrich the few while exploiting the many. The political establishment is telling us there's little we can do to change this direction that we're going in. But I don't believe it, and I suspect you don't either. It's time to break free from the old economy and the old politics. In other words, it's time for a Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is an emergency 4-part program of specific solutions for moving America quickly out of crisis and into the secure green future. We call these solutions a Green New Deal because they're inspired by the New Deal programs that helped get us out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And these solutions are green because they create an economy that makes our communities sustainable and healthy. So, the 4 parts. First, we will guarantee the economic rights of all Americans, beginning with the right to a job at a living wage for every American willing and able to work. Second, we will transition to a sustainable green economy for the 21st century by adopting green technologies and sustainable production. Third, we will reboot and reprogram the financial sector so that it serves everyday people and our communities, and not the other way around. And fourth, we will protect these gains by expanding and strengthening our democracy so that our government and our economy finally serve we the people. So, focusing first on the Economic Bill of Rights. This establishes our rights to an economy that serves us. It means everyone willing and able to work has a right to that work at a living wage. All of us will have the right to quality education, health care, housing, and utilities as part of this Economic Bill of Rights. And each of us has the right to unionize, to fair taxation, and to fair trade. The promise of an economic Bill of Rights came out of the last period of widespread and extreme economic hardship in the Great Depression. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union address, said that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. FDR's promise lives on through the United Nations that Eleanor Roosevelt was central to founding, and 20 years later, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. raised up the call again for an economic Bill of Rights, insisting that it was needed in order to free America of the continuing misery of racism and poverty. And that need still exists. The Roosevelts, the Kings, and the tens of millions of Americans who have struggled for these rights of freedom from economic enslavement, their cause is our urgent cause today. Our country cannot truly move forward until the roots of inequality are pulled up and the seeds of a new, healthier economy are planted. The Green New Deal does that by fulfilling this promise of an economic Bill of Rights. We will end unemployment in America once and for all by ensuring that job at a living wage for every American, and that includes jobs that improve our environment, like clean energy, organic agriculture, public transportation, and clean renewable energy. It also provides jobs that provide urgently needed social infrastructure for public education, health care, child care, elder care, youth programs, and arts and culture. Our full employment program will create 16 million jobs through a community-based direct employment initiative that will be nationally funded, locally controlled, and democratically protected against conflicts of interest and pay-to-play influence peddling. The program will directly create jobs in the public and private sector. And instead of going to an unemployment office when you can't find work, you simply go to the local employment office to get a public or private sector job. These 16 million jobs in the full employment program is 8 times the number sought in Obama's most recent jobs proposal. In addition, our program indirectly creates another 8 million jobs in the private sector as paychecks are spent in our local economies, consumer demand surges, and businesses hire new employees to meet that demand. This program will not be run from Washington, D.C. Our job in Washington will be limited to ensuring that you have a say in how this program runs. Local communities will be responsible for putting this jobs program into practice through a process of broad community input and democratic decision-making that involves you, your neighbors, and local government, not corrupting moneyed interests. Pay-to-play prohibitions will ensure that anyone participating in decision-making has not received campaign contributions or lobbying favors from either proponents or from applicants. Using this process, counties and municipalities can plan projects and jobs in public works and public services that meet their needs as they see them. These jobs will be stored in local jobs banks while they will stand ready to take up any slack in the private sector employment. The Green New Deal's full employment program will change what it means to be a working person in America. It ends the agonizing wait for a business recovery that's not in the cards. It creates jobs that can never be produced by trickle-down giveaways to the rich, and it will move our economy decisively because it will put paychecks back into people's pockets and put consumers back into stores, and all by meeting needs of our communities and making them healthy, just, and sustainable. Full employment is the first and central part of the Green New Deal's Economic Bill of Rights, but life is more than work and paychecks, and we must fulfill the full promise of that Economic Bill of Rights. Therefore, my administration will honor the right to quality health care through an improved Medicare for All program. This will provide comprehensive care for all, It will be free to consumers at the point of delivery, but will save money overall by reducing the massive, wasteful health insurance bureaucracy and by stabilizing medical inflation. And it restores freedom of choice, so you pick your healthcare provider, and your care is decided by you and your provider, not by a profiteering insurance executive. This will be federally financed and democratically controlled. And we will honor the right to tuition-free, quality public education from preschool through college at public institutions. And we will forgive student loan debt left over from the current era of unaffordable college education. And we will honor the right to decent, affordable housing, including an immediate halt to all foreclosures and evictions. We will create a federal bank with local branches to take over homes with distressed mortgages and either restructure the mortgages to affordable levels, or if occupants cannot afford a mortgage, to rent those homes to the occupants. And we will expand rental and home ownership assistance, create ample public housing and capital grants to nonprofit developers of affordable housing until all people can obtain decent housing at no more than 25% of their income. We will honor workers' rights, including the right to a living wage, a safe workplace, to fair trade, and to organize a union at work without fear of firing or reprisals. The idea that the Bill of Rights does not apply to you when you enter your workplace is an idea that says you are only free when you are not working. This is not acceptable in America. And we will honor the right to accessible and affordable utilities. That means heat, electricity, phone, internet, and public transportation that will be made available to all through democratically run, publicly owned utilities that operate at cost, not for profit. We will honor that oldest of American rights, the right to fair taxation that's distributed in proportion to the ability to pay. And we will make any corporate tax subsidies transparent by putting these subsidies in public budgets where they can be scrutinized, not hidden in tax breaks in complicated tax codes. In honoring these rights, we will create the basis for a new economy, an economy that is stable and not vulnerable to speculation, an economy that's prosperous and that pays for itself through the creation of real wealth that is distributed throughout America, an economy that is no longer dragged down by big corporations preying on the elderly, the poor, the disabled, the unemployed, and the young, but which instead supports small businesses, individual liberty, and local thriving communities. The second priority of the Green New Deal is a green transition program. This will convert the old gray economy into the new green economy. And we will do this by shifting to green technologies and sustainable ways of making things. And we must do this now because the environment is the foundation for our economy as well as for life itself. And that environment is deeply imperiled. The benefits we get from the environment dwarf those that come to us from human economic activity, even when measured strictly in dollar terms. And what we usually call the environment is really just another word for Mother Nature's economy. A business model that destroys our forests, our fisheries, our topsoil, our water supplies, our health, and our climate, that's a business model that will inevitably collapse upon itself, and sooner rather than later. An economy that is addicted to ever-increasing supplies of oil and fossil fuels is not only doomed, it's a national security disaster waiting to happen. At the recent UN climate conference in South Africa, the Obama administration worked very hard to delay international agreements on carbon emissions until 2020. This delay will allow critical climate tipping points to be passed that will accelerate warming to the point that it cannot be controlled. As renowned NASA scientist James Hansen puts it, delaying action to aggressively lower carbon would mean game over for the climate, and therefore for civilization as we know it. So for that reason, the Green New Deal will address these problems with a World War II scale mobilization to transform the way that we produce and use energy. We will provide leadership along the way to those binding international agreements that will return the carbon burden in our atmosphere to safe levels, and we will proceed with utmost urgency and put the United States 30 years ahead of the global curve and let the rest of the world catch up to us. If you are someone who wants to start a small business or a worker cooperative or a community cooperative in the green economy or in providing other vital community needs, you will find an ally in the Green Transition Program. Right now, our federal government subsidizes rich agribusiness corporations and the oil, mining, nuclear, coal, and timber giants at the expense of small business and small farmers and our children's environment. We spend tens of billions every year moving our economy in the wrong direction. Instead, we will redirect that money to the real job creators who make our communities more healthy, sustainable, and secure, all at the same time. The Green Transition Program will provide grants and low-interest loans to grow green businesses and cooperatives with an emphasis on small, locally based companies and co-ops that keep the wealth created by local labor circulating and enriching the local community, rather than being drained off to enrich absentee investors. These types of businesses provide a solid foundation for our prosperity. It's a prosperity that will not be offshored or outsourced or downsized, and that will be unaffected by the collapse of foreign credit markets. This Green Transition Program will also redirect research money from fossil fuels and other dead-end industries towards research in wind, solar, and geothermal. We will invest in research in sustainable, non-toxic materials, closed-loop cycles that eliminate waste and pollution, as well as organic agriculture and permaculture and sustainable forestry. The 16 million jobs created by the full employment program mentioned earlier will be the core of this Green Transition Program and will provide jobs in sustainable energy, transportation, and manufacturing infrastructure, clean renewable energy generation, energy efficiency retrofitting, intra-city mass transit and intercity railroads, weatherization, complete streets that safely encourage bike and pedestrian traffic and prioritize it, and regionalize food systems based on sustainable organic agriculture and clean manufacturing of the goods needed to support this sustainable economy. A new world really is possible. We can and must shift to an economy in which 100% of our electricity is generated renewably. We can and must leave the old economy behind, which was based on mining, extraction, and dirty, dangerous, expensive nuclear power. We can and must stop poisoning ourselves, our children, and other living creatures. When we make the investment required to clean up our emissions and waste, our economy will be revitalized by the wealth that stays in America rather than being sent abroad. Our national security will no longer be vulnerable to disruption of oil, and we won't have to send our most precious resource, our young men and women abroad, to fight wars for oil. Healthcare costs will go down because the foundations of a green economy, which are clean energy, healthy food, pollution prevention, and active transportation, these are also the foundations of human health. Or to put it another way, greening our economy also reduces the drivers of preventable chronic disease, which consume a staggering 75% of healthcare costs in America. All in all, this is an investment that will pay off immeasurably as we build healthy, just, and sustainable communities. Speaking of investments, the takeover of our economy by big banks and well-connected financiers has destabilized both our democracy and our economy, as you know. We do not need and we should not tolerate the dictatorship of banks and financiers who manipulate money without doing productive work and who enrich themselves at the expense of real businesses and real working people. It's time to take Wall Street out of the driver's seat and to free the truly productive segments of working America to make this economy work for all of us. That's why a third priority of the Green New Deal is real financial reform, beginning by breaking up the big banks and retaking our monetary policy back from the Federal Reserve banks. We will reboot and reprogram the financial sector so that everyday Americans no longer need to live in fear of periodic crashes that are not of our making. The financial reforms of the original New Deal in the 1930s turned a failing unregulated system into a stable regulated one that did not experience a financial crisis for half a century. But then, in the 1990s, as the Democratic and Republican parties cozied up to this deep-pocketed industry, the New Deal protections were tossed aside in an era of deregulation. This misguided deregulation resulted in ever bigger and more frequent financial crises, including the collapse of 2008. Currently, U.S. banks and corporations have huge cash assets that are badly needed for business expansion, yet lending and investment for that expansion is stagnant. Meanwhile, financial institutions are profiting from speculative trading in stocks and bonds and commodities and currencies and derivatives, and they are rearranging who owns existing productive assets instead of investing to create new productive assets. The rich get richer while the economy stagnates, unemployment persists, and needed investments in infrastructure and production are not being made. The greed and speculation and fraud that crashed the economy continues unabated as we suffer through a recovery for the 1% alone, and it continues to threaten further recovery with backdoor bailouts and the very real potential to tank the economy again. There is currently bipartisan failure going on in Washington to pursue the vitally needed reforms that will be required. The watered-down Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform did not fix the massive problems with the deregulated financial status quo. Wall Street and the banking interests continue to steer the economy just as they did before the great financial crash of 2008. Bank assets are actually more concentrated than they were before the crash, and depository commercial banking, speculative investment banking, and insurance remain intermingled under giant bank holding companies. The financial system is as over-leveraged and vulnerable as ever. Many big banks survive only by hiding their liabilities and avoiding honest bookkeeping. Yet, the officers of these bailed-out firms continue to pay themselves record-level bonuses and to devise new schemes for skimming profits from Main Street in order to keep enriching Wall Street. Well, it's time to really reform Wall Street so that working America has a chance. Here's what the financial reforms of the Green New Deal will do. First, the debt overhang. The debt overhang that's holding back the economy must be deleveraged by reducing homeowner and student debt burdens. An immediate halt to all foreclosures and evictions, as called for in the Economic Bill of Rights, will be coupled to the creation of a federal bank with local branches to take over distressed mortgages and either restructure them to affordable levels or, if occupants cannot afford a mortgage, rent those homes to the occupants. Forgiving student debt will be coupled to tuition-free higher education on the model of the post-World War II GI Bill, which has paid for itself more than 7 times over in increased government revenues from higher productivity, according to a study by the Congressional Joint Economic Committee in the 1980s. We will democratize monetary policy to bring about public control of the monetary supply and credit creation, This means we'll nationalize the private bank-dominated Federal Reserve banks and place them under a monetary authority within the Treasury Department, along the lines proposed in the National Emergency Employment Defense, or NEED Act of 2011, sponsored by Representatives Dennis Kucinich and John Conyers. Through the Green New Deal's financial reforms, the federal government will retake its powers to create money, as created in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. That is just a beginning. Through the financial reforms, the Green Deal will also do these policies. We will break up the oversized banks that are too big to fail. We will end taxpayer-funded bailouts for banks, insurers, and other financial companies. We'll use the FDIC resolution process for failed banks to reopen them as public banks where possible after failed loans and underlying assets are auctioned off. We will adequately regulate all financial derivatives and require them to be traded on open exchanges. We will restore the Glass-Steagall separation of depository commercial banks from speculative investment banks. We'll establish a 90% tax on bonuses for bailed-out bankers. We will support the formation of federal, state, and municipal public-owned banks that function as nonprofit utilities. Under the Green New Deal, we will start building a financial system that is open, honest, stable, and serves the real economy rather than the phony economy of high finance. So now we have the three sections of the Green New Deal. First, the Economic Bill of Rights, beginning with the Full Employment Program. Second, a Green Transition Program to create a sustainable economy with green technologies and sustainable ways of making things. And third, real financial reform that reboots the financial sector. But we won't get those vital reforms without a fourth and final set of reforms to give us a real functioning democracy. And we don't have that in America today. And so just as we are replacing the old economy with a new one, we need a new politics to restore the promise of American democracy. When corporations and big money dominate our elections, government of, by, and for the people cannot take root. And for this reason, we urgently support the move to amend our Constitution to make clear that corporations are not persons and money is not speech. Those rights belong to living, breathing human beings like you and me, and not to business entities controlled by the very wealthy. The executive branch does not have much of an official role in constitutional reform, but a president certainly can and should use the bully pulpit to overturn the un-American idea that the 1% has rights as a class that the rest of us are denied. And a president can and should support Representative Jesse Jackson Jr.'s proposed right to vote amendment to clarify to the Supreme Court that yes, we do have a constitutional right to vote. The Green New Deal also requires the enactment of the Voter Bill of Rights. This is a 10-point platform that is the calling card of the modern-day voting rights movement. And it became a consensus agenda in the years following the stolen presidential election of 2000. Enactment of this Voter Bill of Rights will guarantee us a voter-marked paper ballot for all voting, and will require that all votes are counted before election results are released. It will also do the following. It will replace partisan oversight of elections with nonpartisan election commissions. It will celebrate our democratic aspirations by making Election Day a national holiday. It will bring simplified, safe, same-day voter registration to the nation so that no qualified voter is barred from the polls. It will do away with so-called winner-take-all elections in which the winner does not have the support of most voters, and it will replace that system with instant runoff voting and with proportional representation, systems most advanced countries now use to good effect. And it will replace big money control of elections with full public financing and free and equal access to the airwaves. guarantee that it will also guarantee equal access to the ballot and to the debates for all qualified candidates. It will abolish the Electoral College and implement direct election of the president, and it will restore the vote to ex-offenders who've paid their debt to society. And it will enact statehood, finally, for the District of Columbia, so that those Americans have representation at last in Congress and full rights to self-rule like the rest of us. Of course, as the great progressive Wisconsinite fighting Bob La Follette taught us, democracy is a life and not merely limited to elections. For this reason, the Green New Deal goes beyond the Voter Bill of Rights to strengthen our country's movement towards democracy in all areas of public life. The Green New Deal will strengthen democracy at the local and state level. Just last week, a federal court told the people of Vermont they could not prevent a dangerous nuclear power plant from operating in their state. The court did this on the basis of a doctrine known as field preemption. Basically, the state of Vermont is barred or preempted from regulating the nuclear power industry just because a federal judge says that the industry is the concern of the federal government only. Over the past 30 years, we've seen public safety, food labeling, human rights, immigrant rights, drug policy, and other reforms preempted in the same way. Well, the Green New Deal establishes federal environmental and human rights protections as a floor and not a ceiling to actions by state and local governments. To do this, we will commission a thorough review of federal preemption law and its impact on the practice of local democracy in the United States. This review will put at its center the democracy question. That is, what level of government is most open to democratic participation and most suited to protecting democratic rights. Implementation of the Green New Deal will put this question at its center and will always work to bring government closest to the people. Democracy doesn't just happen in our political system, it happens in our economy every day. And today more than 500,000 American workers are employed by cooperatives. Over 120 million people are member owners of consumer cooperatives, and nearly 40,000 businesses are organized as cooperatives, and another 11,000, which are not co-ops, are employee stock-owned companies known as ESOPs. Co-ops have been shown to be very effective producers of jobs and wealth, yet the federal government does not reward cooperative development in the same way that it supports private business corporations. The corporations have their U.S. Department of Treasury, while co-ops have no such entity. So the Green New Deal will create a corporation for economic democracy, a new federal corporation like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to provide publicity, training, education, and direct financing for cooperative development and for democratic reforms to make government agencies, private associations, and business enterprises more participatory. And speaking of the public broadcasting, the Green New Deal strengthens media democracy by expanding federal support for locally owned broadcast media and local print media. And finally, we must protect our liberty from those who would frighten us into surrendering our freedoms in the name of security. The Green New Deal will repeal the Patriot Act and those parts of the National Defense Authorization Act that violate our civil liberties. It will prohibit the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI from conspiring with local police forces to suppress our freedoms of assembly and of speech. And it will end the war on immigrants, including the cruel so-called Secure Communities program, which is actually terrorizing millions of Americans, both citizens and non-citizen immigrants alike, on no basis other than their perceived immigration status. Protecting our liberty requires one additional important step. Washington and Eisenhower, both generals who became president, warned us about the military-industrial complex. They warned us about the dangers of empire. The Green New Deal includes a 50% reduction in military spending and the withdrawal of U.S. military bases from the over 100 countries in which our military is now located. It calls for the restoration of the National Guard as the centerpiece of our system of national defense. It creates a new round of nuclear disarmament initiatives. Overall, it requires shifting from an economy in which the majority of our discretionary budget is spent on war and occupation of other countries to an economy that provides the secure, just, peaceful future that we all deserve. So, tonight, we've laid out an agenda for a Green New Deal for America. This agenda would revitalize our democracy and start solving the serious problems that are not being solved by the business-as-usual approach coming out of Washington. The Green New Deal will end unemployment. It will honor and enrich the lives of every member of our society. It will convert our economy from gray to green. It will end the cycle of financial boom and collapse. It will allow real democracy to take root. Securing the Green New Deal depends not on me or the Green Party or some professional politician on television. It depends on all of us standing up together and declaring that we've had enough of the insider-run big money politics that rules Washington. And it depends on each of us using our concern, our energy, our intelligence, our hearts, and our minds to find ways to improve the lives of our community. This change will never come from the top. It never comes from the career politicians or the powerful Washington lobbyists. Real change has to come from us, the grassroots, from people who work hard every day, pounding the nails, driving the trucks, changing the sheets, teaching the children, plowing the fields, and making the real economy work. In the traditional State of the Union address, the President of the United States thanks the people that he or she respects, and tonight I will do so too. So thank you to the people who struggle against steep odds to keep a roof over their heads, to feed their families, and to find jobs where there are few to be had. Thank you to the mothers and fathers who work so hard to raise the next generation and to educate your children in these challenging times. To the senior citizens who built this country and who deserve Social Security and Medicare support in their retirement. Thank you to the public employees who teach our children, who keep us safe, who care for the needy, who clean our schools, who keep the trains running. And thank you to the thousands of you who've already joined me and my campaign team at Jill Stein for President as we all work to take back the promise of our democracy. And thank you to the young men and women in the democracy movements in Europe and in the Middle East, and especially those who are braving the guns and the tanks on behalf of liberation and freedom for us all. And thank you to the people of Wisconsin who rose up in the tens and the hundreds and now the thousands of thousands to defend and expand their democracy and our democracy. And thank you to the occupiers of Wall Street in Manhattan and across the country who continue to prove in these cold, hard months that Tom Paine's Winter Soldier lives on in America. And thank you all for giving us the courage to take on these urgent tasks in these times, knowing that the future of people, peace, and the planet depends on us all. So let us not rest until we have pulled our nation back from the brink and we have secured the peaceful, just, green future that we all deserve and that is within our reach. Thank you so much.